Hello, sweeties. I hope you're having a really good night, or evening, or afternoon. I'm sorry if you hear any clicking in the back or any sounds of atmosphere. I have my window open, but if it gets too noisy, I'll make sure to close it. It would be ideal. Good morning, sweeties. Good morning. Hey, let me put this over here. I'm sorry for the clickies. Okay. Oh, don't worry, Lumi. I'm just glad you can join us. Does everything sound okay? Is audio alright? Okay, I won't be worried. But is my voice okay? Is it too loud? Are the background sounds too loud? Hello. Hello, everyone. Hi, Kat. Hello, Nick. Hello, Zachi. And Lumi. And everyone else who's here. Hello. Hello. Might be a good idea to actually close the window. Oh, hello, Zan. Let me know, guys. I can close the window. It's not an issue. Oh, thank you for reminding me, Zan. Alright, give me a moment real quick. Okay, sweeties. Let's have our relaxing story time. And I will continue until around 4 a.m., 4:20 a.m. I may close the window. I'm unsure. It's more so I'm just concerned it's making a lot of sounds. Oh my. Thank you, sweeties. Give me a moment. Okay, I'll try not to. Anyway, we'll be reading The Little Mermaid to start with, since I thought it was a befitting summer theme. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being supportive. Hopefully, the sounds won't bother too much. But if the train comes by, I'm so sorry. I'll make sure to mute, okay? Because the train can be really loud. Okay, the Little Mermaid. Far out at sea, where the water is blue as the petals of the loveliest cornflower, and as clear as the purest glass. But it is very deep, deeper than any anchor cable can reach. Many church towers would have to be placed on top of each other to stretch out from the seabed to the surface. Down here, the sea folk live. Do not believe, though, that there is nothing but the bare white sand on the seabed. No, the most marvelous trees and plants grow there, and that they have such pliant trunks and stems and leaves that the slightest movement of the water causes them to move as if they were alive. All the fishes, great and small, slip between their branches, just as birds do up here in the air. At the very deepest spot lies the Sea King's palace. The walls are of coral, and the tall, pointed windows of the clearest amber, but the roof is of mussel shells that open and close as the water passes. It looks so lovely, for in each of them lies gleaming pearls, a single one of them which would be a prize gem in a queen's crown. For many years, the Sea King down there had been a widower, but his old mother kept house for him. She was a wise woman, but proud of her high birth, so she always wore 12 oysters on her tail, while all the other fine folk were only allowed to wear 6. Otherwise, she deserved much praise, especially because she was so fond of the small sea princesses, the daughters of her son. There were 6 lovely children, but the youngest one was the most beautiful of them all. Her skin was so clear and delicate. Oh my bad. Her skin was as clear and delicate as a rose petal, her eyes as blue as the deepest sea. But like the rest of them, she had no feet. Her body ended in a fish's tail. All day long they could spend playing down in the palace, in the great halls where living flowers grew out of the walls. The great amber windows would open, and then the fishes would swim into them, and just as the swallows fly into us when we open the windows. But the fishes swam right up to the small princess, and always ate out of her hand, and allowed themselves to be stroked. Outside the palace, there was a large garden with bright red and dark blue trees, with fruit that shone like gold and flowers that blazed like a fire in the constantly moving stems and leaves. The earth itself was the finest sand, but blue as a flare of silver. There lay a mysterious blue sheen over everything down there. It would be easier to believe one was high up in the air and could only see the sky above and beneath one than that was down on the seabed. Old English. When the sea was calm, one could make out the sun. It seemed to be like a purple flower with its entire light streaming out of its center. Each of the small princesses had their own little plot in the garden, where she could dig and sew as she wanted. One gave her a flower plot the form of a whale, another preferred hers to look like a little mermaid, but the youngest princess made hers completely round, like the sun, and only had flowers that shone red like it did. She was a strange child, quiet and thoughtful, while the other sisters added the most remarkable things they had taken from stranded ships as decoration. All she wanted to have, apart from the red rose flowers that resembled the sun high above, was a beautiful marbled statue. It was of a fine-looking lad, carved out of clear white stone and left on the seabed after a ship had stranded. At its base she planted a rose-red weeping willow. It grew splendidly and hung with its fresh branches over the statue. Down towards the blue seabed, where its shadow appeared to be violet and in motion, just like the branches, it looked as if the treetop and its roots pretended to be kissing each other. Nothing made her happier than to hear about the human world above. The old grandmother had to tell them all she knew about ships and cities, people and animals, and what seemed especially delightful to her was that up on the earth the flowers had a scent, for they did not down in the ocean bed, and that the forests were green and the fish could not be seen among their branches, could sing so loudly and sweetly that it had gladdened the heart, and it was of the small birds that the grandmother called fish, for otherwise the sisters were not able to understand her, as they have never seen a bird. Give me a quick moment, okay, everyone? Okay, I'm back. When you complete your 15th year, grandmother said, you will be allowed to rise up out of the sea, sit in the moonlight on the rocks and watch the big ships sail past. You will see forests and cities. During the following year, one of the sisters turned 15, but the others, well, each one was a year younger than the other, so the youngest had no less than 5 years to wait before she would venture to come up from the seabed and see how things are in our world. But each one of them promised the other to relate what she had seen and found most delightful on that first day, for the grandmother did not tell them enough. There was so much that they wanted to know. None was as full of longing as the youngest one, the very princess who had the longest time to wait, and who was so quiet and thoughtful. Many a night she would stand at the open window and gaze up through the dark blue water, where the fishes swished their fins and tails. She could see the moon and the stars. Their gleam was admittedly somewhat pale, but through the water they looked much larger than they do to our eyes. If what they look like a black cloud passed beneath them, She knew it was either a whale swimming above her or possibly a ship with many people on board. They certainly didn't think that there might be a lovely little mermaid standing below them, stretching her white hands up towards the Nile. Now the oldest princess was 15 years old and was to venture above the surface of the sea. When she came back, she had hundreds of things to tell, but the most delightful, she said, was to lie in the moonlight on a sandbank in the calm water and see close to the coast the great city, where the lights twinkled like hundreds of stars, to hear the music and the noise and the clamor of carriages and humans, see the many church towers and spires, and to hear the bells ringing out. Precisely because she could not come up there, she had longed for all these things. Oh, how the youngest sisters were all ears. But when later that evening she stood by the open window and gazed up through the dark blue water, she thought of the great city with all its noise and clamor, and she believed she could hear the church bells sounding down where she was. The following year, the second sister... Oh my... I'm sorry, everyone. The following year, the second sister was allowed to rise through the... Sorry. There we go. Was allowed to rise through the water and swim wherever she wanted. She swam up just as the sun was setting, and it was the sight which she felt was the loveliest. The whole sky had looked as if it was of gold, she said, and the clouds, well, their loveliness she could not describe enough. Red and yellow, they had sailed over her head, but far swifter than them, like a long white veil, a flock of wild swans had flown over the sea, where the sun stood. She swam towards it, but it sank, and the rosy gleam of the surface of the sea and the clouds were extinguished. The following year, a third sister came up there. She was the boldest of them all, so she swam up a broad that flowed into the sea. She saw lovely green slopes with vines and castles, and manors peeped out between magnificent forests. She heard how all the birds sang, and the sun shone so strongly that she often had to dive down under the surface to cool her burning face. In a small bay she met a whole flock of small human children, completely naked. They ran about and splashed in the water. She wanted to play with them, but they ran away in fear, and a small black animal appeared. It was a dog, but she had never seen a dog before. It barked so terribly at her that she was scared and made for the open sea. But she could never forget the magnificent forests and the green hillsides and the charming children who could swim on the water, even though they didn't have any tail. The fourth sister was not as bold. She stayed out in the wild mid-ocean and said that it was precisely this that was the loveliest. One could see many miles around, one on all sides, and the sky above was like a great bell jar. She had seen ships, but far off they looked like gulls, and amusing dolphins had turned somersaults, and the huge whales had sprouted water up on their blowholes, so it had looked like hundreds of fountains around her. It was now the fifth sister's turn. Her birthday happened to be in the winter, and so she saw what the others had not seen on their first visit. The water looked quite green, and great icebergs were swimming around it. Each of them looked like pearls. She said that yet they were far bigger than the church towers humans built. They appeared in the most remarkable shapes and glittered like diamonds. She sat down on one of the largest, and all the sailing ships in Bright gave her a wide berth, where she sat letting the wind play with her long hair. But later in the evening the sky became overcast. There was thunder and lightning, while the black sea lifted great blocks of ice high up and let them gleam in the red lightning. The sails were taken in on all the ships, and they were in fear of dread, but she calmly sat on her swimming iceberg and watched the blue stroke of lightning zigzag down into the gleaming sea. The first time any of the sisters came above the water, each of them were almost fascinated by the new, beautiful things she saw. But since they now, as grown-up girls, were allowed to go up wherever they wanted, things lost their appeal. They longed to be back home, and after a month they said it was the most beautiful of all down where they lived, and so nice to be home. On many an evening the 5 sisters interlocked arms and rose in a row above the water. They had beautiful voices, more beautiful than any humans, and when a storm blew up, so they thought the ships were bound to go under, they would swim in the front of the ships and sing so beautifully of how delightful it was on the seabed, and tell the sailors not to be frightened of coming down there. But the sailors were unable to understand the words, and thought it was the storm, nor did they ever get to see any of these delights, for when their ship sank, those on board drowned and only came down to the Sea King's palace as corpses. When the sisters gathered in the evening, arm in arm, and ascended through the sea, their little sister was thus left behind, all on her own. And it was as if she would cry, but a mermaid has no tears, and so she had to suffer all the more. "Ah, if only I was 15 years old," she said. "I know that I will grow really fond of the world above us and of the people who build and live up there. At last she reached the age of 15. "There, now we've got you off our hands," her grandmother, the old Queen Mother, said. "Come here and let me deck you out like your older sisters," and she placed a garland of white lilies in her hair, but each petal of the flower was half a pearl, and the old lady had 8 large oysters attached themselves to the prince's tail to indicate her high rank. "It hurts so much," the little mermaid said. "Yes, one has to go through a great deal of trouble to look nice," the old woman said. Oh, she would so much have liked to shake all this finery off of her and laid the heavy garland aside. Her red flowers in the garden suited her much better, but she didn't dare rearrange things. "Goodbye," she said, and rose so light and clear, like a bubble through the water. The sun had just set as she lifted her head above the surface of the water. All but the clouds were still gleaming like roses of gold, and in the midst of a pale red sky the evening star shone with such brightness and beauty, and the air was mild and fresh, and the sea absolutely still. On it was a large ship with 3 masts, with only a single sail up. for there was not a breath of wind, and here and there in the ropes and on the beams the sailors were sitting. There was music and singing. As the evening grew darker, hundreds of many-colored lamps were lit, so it looked as if the flags of every nation were waving in the wind. The little mermaid swam right up to the cabin window, and each time the swell lifted her up, she could look through the mirror-clear windows, where the many people stood in fine array. But the handsomest even so was the young prince with large black eyes. He couldn't have been much older than 16. It was his birthday, which was why there was so much of ado. The sailors were dancing on the deck, and the young prince came out. More than 100 rockets shot up in the air, and they lit everything up as if it was broad daylight. So the little mermaid was very frightened and dived under the surface, but soon she stuck her head up again, and then it was as if all the stars in the sky fell down to her. She had never seen such a sight before. Great suns span around, wonderful fire fishes soared into the blue sky, and everything was reflected by the clear, calm sea. On board the ship, everything was so bright that one could see a little rope and the people too. And oh, how handsome the young prince was! He clasped people's hands and laughed and smiled, while the music ran out in the wonderful evening. It grew late, but the little mermaid was unable to take her eyes off the ship, and the handsome prince, and the many-colored lamps were put out, but no more rockets soared into the sky. There was no more cannon shots, but deep down in the sea there was a humming and droning. Whereas she sat on the surface, rocking up and down, so that she could look into the cabin. But the ship picked up speed, one sail after the other unfurled. Now the waves became stronger, and large clouds appeared, and there was a lightning in the distance. Oh, there was going to be a terrible storm. So the sailors reefed in the sails, and the large ship careered along at great speed on the wild waves. The water rose to form what looked like a great black mountains that would crash down over the mast. But the ship dipped like a swan down between the high waves to let itself to be lifted up on the towering waters. The little mermaid found this ride enjoyable, but the sailors did not, and the ship creaked and groaned. The thick planking bent at the buffering of the waves. The mast broke in two as if it was a reed, and the ship rolled over on its side, and the water began to pour in. Now the little mermaid realized that they were in danger. She had to take care of herself to avoid the beams and the fragments of the ship that were floating in the water. At one moment, it was so pitch black that she couldn't see the slightest thing. But when a flash of lightning came, everything was so clear once more that she could make out all of them on the ship. Everyone lunged around as best as they could. She looked especially for the young prince, and when the ship came apart, she saw him sink down into the depths of the ocean. To begin with, she was quite pleased, for now he would be coming down to her. But she remembered the humans cannot live in the water, and that he would not come down to her father's palace, only his corpse. No, he could not be allowed to die, so she swam in among the beams and planks that drifted on the sea, completely forgot that they might have crushed her. She dived deep beneath the surface and rose up high again between the waves, and finally she managed to reach the young prince, who was hardly able to swim any longer in the stormy sea. His arms and legs were beginning to go limp, and his beautiful eyes to close. He would have died if the little mermaid had not come to his aid. She held his head above the water, and then let the waves bear her and him wherever they wanted. When the morning came, the bad weather was over. Not a shred of the ship was to be seen. The sun rose red and gleaming out of the water. It was as if it brought life to the prince's cheeks, but his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his lovely high forehead and stroked back his wet hair. To her he looked like a marble statue, like the one she had down in her little garden. She kissed him again and wished for him to be allowed to live. Okay. She now saw the mainland ahead of her, tall blue mountains with white snow gleaming on their summits, as if the swans were lying there. Down by the coast, where there were lovely green forests, and in front of them lay a church or an abbey. She did not know for sure, but it was definitely a building. Lemon and orange trees grew in the garden, and in front of the gate stood tall palm trees. The shore formed a small bay here where the water was completely still but deep, all the way to the cliff where fine silver sand had been washed up. She swam over there with the handsome prince and laid him down on the sand, but made sure that his head lay high up in the warm sunshine. Now the bells in the large white building began to chime, and many young girls came walking through the garden, and the little mermaid swam further out behind some boulders that struck up out of the water. Placed sea foam in her hair and in her breast so that no one could see her small face, and she watched to see who came out to the poor prince. It did not take long before a young girl came to the spot. She seemed quite to be shocked, but only for a moment. Then she fetched some others, and the mermaid saw how the prince recovered, and that he smiled to all those around him, but not out to her, for he did not know that she had saved him. She felt so sad, and when he was led into a large building, she dived sorrowfully down into the water and sought her way home to her father's palace. She had always been quiet and thoughtful, but now she was even more so. Her sisters asked her what she had seen the first time up above, but she did not tell them anything. Many an evening and morning rose, she came up to the spot where she had left the prince. She saw how the fruit in the garden ripened and it was picked. She saw how the snow melted on the high mountains, but she did not see the prince, and therefore she was always even more sadder when she returned home. Her only consolation I'm sorry, I'm so bad at English, was to sit in her little garden and embrace a beautiful marble statue that looked like her prince. But she did not tend to her flowers They grew as in the wilderness, out over the paths, and twined their long stems and leaves in among the branches so that they became quite dark. Finally, she couldn't bear it any longer, and she told one of her sisters, and soon all of them had got to hear of it, but only her older sisters and a couple of other mermaids who only told their closest friends. One of them knew the identity of the prince, and she had seen the festivals on the ship, knew where he had come from and where his kingdom lay. "Come, little sister," the other princesses said, with their arms round each other's shoulder. They rose in a long row out of the sea in front of the palace, in front of the place where they knew the prince's palace lay. It had been built a light yellow, gleaming type of stone, with a large marble staircase. One went straight down to the sea. Magnificent gilt domes rose up above the roof, and beneath the columns that went around the entire building were marble statues that looked as if they were alive. Through the clear glass in the tall windows, one could see a glimpse of the most magnificent halls that were hung with precious silk curtains and tapestries, and all the walls were adorned with large paintings that were a sheer joy to look at. In the middle of the largest hall there was a large plashing fountain, its jets shooting up towards a glass dome in the ceiling, through which the sun shone on the water and on the lovely plants growing in the large pool. Now she knew where he lived, and she went there many an evening, the night on the water. She went there many an evening, and on the night on the water she swam much closer to the land than any of the others had dared. She even went right up into the narrow canal under the magnificent marble balcony that cast a long shadow over the water. Here she sat and gazed at the young prince, who thought he was completely alone in the bright moonlight. Many evenings she saw him sail about with music in his magnificent boat with its fluttering flags. She peeped out through the green rushes, and if the wind caught her silver white veil, and anyone... Oh, my bad, my tummy rumbled. Many evenings she saw him sail about with music in his magnificent boat with its fluttering flags. She peeped out through the green rushes, and if the wind caught her silver white veil, and anyone saw it, they thought it was a swan lifting its wings. Many a night, when the fishermen were out at sea with their blazing torches, she heard them say many good things about the young prince, and it pleased her that she had saved his life when he was drifting half dead on the waves. She thought of how firmly his head had rested on her breast, and how she had kissed him then. He knew nothing about that, couldn't even dream about her. She came to like human things more and more, and she wished more and more to be able to rise up among them. Their world seemed to be much bigger than hers, for they could fly across the ocean on ships, climb high mountains way above the clouds, and the countries they owned stretched with their forests and fields farther than the eye could see. There was so much she wanted to know, but her sisters could not answer everything. So she asked her grandmother, and she was familiar with the higher world, which in what she rightfully called the lands above the sea. "When humans do not drown," the little mermaid asked, Can they stay alive forever? Don't they die like we do down here in the sea? Train. Oh yes, the old woman said. They too have to die, and their lives are even shorter than ours. We can live until we are 300 years old, but when we cease to exist, we become foam on the water. Do not even have a grave down here among our dear ones. We do not have an immortal soul. We never will live again. We are like the green rushes. Once they have been severed, they can never grow green again. Humans, on the other hand, have the soul that lives forever, lives after the body has become earth. It rises up through the clear sky, up to all the shining stars. Just as we rise up to the surface of the sea and see the lands of the humans, they rise up to the unknown lovely places, those we will never get to see. Why did we never get an immortal soul? The little mermaid asked sadly. I would give up all the 300 years I have to live just to be a human being for one day, and then be part of the heavenly world. You mustn't spend your time thinking of such things, the old woman said. We have a much happier and better life than a human beings do up there. So am I to die and float on the foam of the sea, not hear the music of the waves, see the lovely flowers and the red sun? Is there nothing I can do to gain an eternal soul? No, the old woman said, only if a human were to fall in love with you, that you were more to him than his father and his mother. If all his thoughts and loves were centered on you, he would let the priest place his right hand in yours and promise to be faithful now and in all eternity. Only then would his soul flow over into your body, and you would partake in human happiness. He would give you a soul, and yet restrain his own. But that can never happen. For what is so lovely here in the ocean, your fish's tail, they find ugly up there on earth. They do not understand it at all. There was one has to have two clumsy props that they call legs in order to be considered beautiful or handsome up there. Then the little mermaid sighed and looked so sadly at her fish's tail. Let's be content, the old woman said. Let's jump and leap in 300 years we have to live in. That's quite a long time after all. And then one can even be more contently rest in one's grave. The evening there is to be a court ball. It was also more magnificent than anything ever seen on earth. The walls of the ceilings of the great dance halls were of thick but clear glass, and several hundred huge mussel shells, rosy red and green as grass, stood in rows on either side with a blue burning fire that lit up the entire hall and gleamed through the walls so that the sea right outside looked quite illuminated. One could see the innumerable fish, great and small, that swam towards the glass wall. On some of them the scales gleamed purple-red, on others they seemed to be silver or gold. A broad running stream ran through the middle of the hall, and on it mermen and mermaids danced to their own delightful singing. The humans on earth do not have such beautiful voices. The little mermaid sang the most beautifully of them all, and the little mermaid sang the most beautifully of them all, and they applauded her, and for a moment she felt happy in her heart, for she knew she had the loveliest voice of anyone on earth and in the sea. But soon she began to think once more of the world above her. She couldn't forget the handsome prince and her sorrow at not owning, as he did, an immortal soul. So she slipped away from her father's palace, and while everything was singing and enjoyment inside, she sat out in her own little garden and was sad. She heard the French horn sounding down through the water, and she thought now he is sailing, the one who I love even more than father and mother, the one who fills all my thoughts and whose hand I wish to place all my life's happiness. I will risk anything to win him, an immortal soul. While my sisters are dancing inside my father's palace, I will go to the sea witch. I've always been afraid of her, but perhaps she can help me. Now the little mermaid left her garden and went towards the roaring whirlpools which behind the witch lived. She had never gone that way before. No flowers grew there, no seagrass, only the bare, gray, sandy bottom stretched towards the whirlpools, where the water, like roaming mill wheels, whirled around and tore everything they caught a hold of down with it into the depths. She had to pass between the crushing, whirling masses of water to get to the region of the sea witch, and here there was for quite some distance no other way than over the hot bubbling mud the witch called her peat bog. Behind it lay her house in the middle of a strange forest. All the trees and shrubs there were polypus, half animal and half plant. They looked like snakes with hundreds of heads growing out of the earth. All the branches were long, slimy arms with fingers like plant worms, and joint by joint they moved on their route to the outermost tip. Everything in the sea they could catch a hold of, they twined around tightly and never let go again. The little mermaid remained standing quite terrified outside there. Her heart pounded with fear. She had almost turned black. She had almost turned back. Oh my god, I'm so dumb. She had almost turned back, but when she thought of the prince and of the human soul, that gave her courage. She bound her long, fluttering hair around her head so that the polypus couldn't grab a hold of it, folded her hands over her breast, and flew, as a fish can fly through the water. And among the horrible polypus which stretched over their pliant arms and fingers after her, she saw that wherever she had seen something, hundreds of small arms. Oh my god. Zoom. The heck? I'm sorry, everyone. Zoom, zoom. Alright, give me a moment. Okay, there we go. Sorry, I was sitting on my leg, so I had to shift out. She saw that wherever they had seen something, hundreds of small arms held it, as with the bands of steel. Humans who had perished at sea and sunk down into the depths peeped out from the polypus's arms as white skeletons. They held on to the ships, rattles and chests, skeletons of land animals, and a little mermaid they had caught and strangled. That was what seemed to her to be the most dreadful of all. She now came to a large, slimy palace in the forest, where large, fat water snakes tumbled and showed their vile white yellow bellies. In the middle of the clearing, a house had been built of white bones of shipwrecked human beings. There the sea witch sat, allowing a toad to eat from her mouth, just as humans allow a small canary to eat sugar. That's weird. The horrible fat water snake she called her small chickens, and she let romp around her large spongy breast. "I know what you want, all right," the sea witch said. "It's very stupid of you, but you shall have your will even so, for it will bring you great misfortune, my lovely princess. You want to get rid of your fish's tail and have two props instead, to go about on just like human beings, so that the young prince can fall in love with you and you can have him and an immortal soul." And just then the witch crackled so loudly and horribly that the toad and the grass snakes fell to the ground and tossed around there. "You've come at precisely the right time," the witch said. "Tomorrow, when the sun rises, I couldn't have helped you. Before another year has passed, I will prepare a drink for you before the sun rises. You must swim with it to where there is land, sit down on the shore, and there drink it, and your tail will split and contract into what humans call a nice pair of legs. But it will hurt you. It will be as if a sharp sword passed right through you. Everyone who sees you will say you are the loveliest human child they have ever seen. You will keep your floating walk. No dancer can float as you can, but each step you take will be like treading on a sharp knife that made your blood flow. Are you prepared to suffer all this? For then I will help you." "Yes," the little mermaid said with a trembling voice. She thought of the prince and of winning an immortal soul. "But remember this," the witch said. "Once you have assumed human form, you can never become a mermaid again. You can never dive down through the waters to your sisters and to your father's palace, and if you do not gain the love of the prince, so that he forgets his father and his mother for you, unless you fill all his thoughts and he lets the priest place your hand together so that you become man and wife, you will not gain an immortal soul. The first morning after he's married someone else, your heart will break, and you will become foam on the water." "That is my wish," the little mermaid said, with a deathly pale. "But you must also pay me," the witch said, "and what I am asking is no trifle. You have the loveliest voice of all here on the seabed, and you count on entrancing him with it. But that voice you must give to me. I must have the best thing you own for my precious drink. I must give you my own blood for the drink, so that it can be as sharp as a double-edged sword." "But if you take my voice," the little mermaid said, "what am I left with?" "Your beautiful appearance," the witch said, "your floating walk and your eloquent eyes. With those, you're sure to be able to captivate a human heart. Well, have you lost your courage? Stretch out your little tongue. I will cut it off as payment, and you shall have your powerful drink." So be it then, the little mermaid said, and the witch fetched her cauldron to boil the magic potion. Cleanliness is next to goldenness, she said, and scorched the inside of it with grass snakes, which she bound into a knot. Now she made a deep scratch in her breast and let the black blood drip into it. The steam formed the queerest shapes, and she was scaring, and queerest shapes that were scaring and frightening. Every second, the witch added new things to the cauldron, and when it boiled away, it was as if a crocodile was crying. Finally, the drink was ready. It looked like the clearest water. There it is, the witch said, and cut the little mermaid's tongue off. She was mute now, unable to sing or speak. If the polypus should seize you as you pass through my forest on the way back, the witch said, just throw a single drop of this drink onto them, and their arms and fingers will burst into thousands of pieces. But the mermaid had no need of this. The polypus retreated in fear when they saw she was carrying the gleaming drink that shone in her hands as if it was a twinkling star. She soon came through the forest, the bog, and the roaring whirlpools. She could see her father's palace, and the lamps had been put out in the large dance hall. They were surely all asleep, but she did not dare to try and find out. Now that she could not speak, and would be leaving them forever, it felt as if her heart would break from sorrow. She stole into the garden, took one flower from each of her sister's flower beds, sent thousands of finger kisses towards the palace, and rose up through the dark blue waters. The sun had not yet appeared when she saw the prince's palace and went up to the magnificent marble staircase. The moon shone wonderfully, so clearly. The little mermaid downed the fiery, sharp drink, and it was as though a two-edged sword went right through her fine body. She fainted and lay as if dead. When the sun was shining over the sea, she woke up and felt a searing pain right in front of the handsome prince. Wait. She felt a searing pain, but right in the front of her was the handsome young prince. He was standing. He fixed his jet-black eyes on her so that she lowered hers and saw that her fish's tail was gone, and that she had the most attractive small white legs any young girl could ask for. Train. I'm sorry, everyone. Train. Let the train pass and I'll continue to read. She had the most attractive small white legs any young girl could ask for, but she was completely naked, so she wrapped herself in her long tresses. The prince asked who she was and how she had come to be there, and she looked at him so gently and so sorrowfully with her dark blue eyes, for she could not speak, you see. Then he took her by the hand and led her into the palace. Every step she took, as the witch had told her earlier, it was as if she was treading on pointed needles and sharp knives. But she put up with this gladly. When the prince's hand holding hers, she rose as light as a soap bubble, and he and everyone else marveled at her elegant floating walk. She was dressed in priceless clothing of silk and muslin. She was the most beautiful of all those at the palace, but she was mute, unable to sing or speak. Lovely slave girls dressed in silk and gold came forward and sang for the prince and his royal parents a song more beautiful than all the others, and the prince clapped his hands and smiled at her. And the little mermaid felt sad, for she knew that she herself would have sung far more beautifully. She thought, oh, if only he knew that in order to be with him I had given away my voice for all eternity. Now the slave girls danced gracefully, floating dances to the loveliest music, and the little mermaid lifted her beautiful white arms, raised herself on tiptoe, and floated across the floor, danced as no one had ever danced before. At her every movement, her loveliness became more apparent, and her eyes spoke more profoundly to the heart than the singing of the slave girls. Everyone was enchanted by this, particularly the prince, who called her his little foundling. And she danced more and more, even though every time her foot touched the ground, it was as if she was treading on sharp knives. The prince said that she was to be with him always, and she was allowed to sleep outside his door on a velvet cushion, like a dog. He had a man's costume sewn for her so that she could follow him on horseback. They rode through the fragrant forests where the green branches brushed her shoulders, and the small birds sang beneath the fresh green leaves. She climbed with the prince on high mountains, and although her fine feet bled so that the others noticed it, she merely laughed at this and followed him until they saw the clouds sailing beneath them, as if they were a flock of birds flying off to a foreign land. Back at the prince's palace, where the others were asleep, she went out onto the broad marble staircase, and it cooled her burning feet to stand there in the cold sea water. And there she thought of them down in the depths of the ocean. One night her sisters came arm in arm, and they sang so sorrowfully as they swam across the water, and she waved to them, and they recognized her and told her how sad she had made them all. Every night they had visited her, and one night far out she saw her old grandmother, who had not been up to the surface of the sea for many years, and the Sea King with his crown on his head. They stretched their arms out towards her, but she did not dare come as close as the shore as her sisters did. Day by day the prince became more dear to her. He was fond of her as one can be fond of a good dear child, but it never occurred to him to make her his queen, and she had to become his wife, otherwise she would never get an immortal soul. But on his wedding morning would become foam on the sea. "Aren't you fonder of me than all of the rest?" the eyes of the little mermaid seemed to say when he took her in his arms and kissed her forehead lovingly. "Yes, you are the dearest of all to me," the prince said, "for you have the best heart of them all. You are the most devoted to me, and you resemble a young girl I once saw, but will surely never find again. I was on a ship that was wrecked, and the waves washed me ashore near a sacred temple where several young girls were in service. The youngest of them all found me down on the shore and saved my life. I only saw her twice. She was the only one I could ever love in this world. But you resemble her. You almost replace her image in my soul. She belongs to the holy temple, and therefore my good fortune has sent you to me. We shall never be parted. Alas, he doesn't know that I was the one who saved his life, the little mermaid thought. I carried him over the sea, to the forest where the temple stands. I sat behind the foam to wait, and waited to see if anyone would come. I saw the beautiful girl he is more fond of than me. The little mermaid sighed deeply. She was unable to cry. The girl belongs to the sacred temple. He has told me she will never come out into this world. They will not ever be able to meet again. I am with him. I see him every day. I will take care of him, love him, and sacrifice my own life to him. But now the prince is to be married and have a lovely daughter of the king of the neighboring country. People said that is why he is equipping a ship so magnificently. The prince is traveling to see the lands of the neighboring king. Oh, my bad. Is the official explanation, but it is to see the neighboring king's daughter. He is to have a large, Wait, give me a moment. I have to clear my throat, everyone. Okay, there we go. That's better. But the little mermaid shook her head and laughed. She knew the prince's thoughts much better than all the rest. I must travel, he said to her. I must see the beautiful princess my parents insist on. But they do not wish to force me to bring her home as my bride. I cannot love her. She does not look like the beautiful girl in the temple that you resemble. If I ever had to choose a bride, it would rather be you, my speechless fondling, with the eloquent eyes. And he kissed her red lips, and played with her long hair, and placed his head close to her heart, so it dreamt of human happiness and an immortal soul. But you are not frightened of the sea, my mute child, he said. They stood on board the magnificent ship that was to take him to the lands of the neighboring king, and he told her about the storms and the dead calms, about a strange fish in the ocean depths, and what the diver had seen there. And she smiled at his account, for of course she knew far better than anyone else about the seabed. In the moonlight night, when everyone was asleep, except for the mate, she sat at the railing of the ship and stared down through the clear water, and she seemed to see her father's palace highest up, stood over her grandmother with her silver crown on her head, and stared up at the swift currents at the keel of the ship. Then her sisters broke the surface of the sea and stared sorrowfully at her and wrung their white hands. She waved to them and smiled and wanted to tell them that the things were going well and successfully for her, but the ship's boy came closer and the sisters dived down. So he thought that what he had seen merely had been white foam on the water. The next morning the ship entered the harbor of the magnificent city of the neighboring king. All the church bells rang out and trumpets sounded from the high towers, while the soldiers stood with fluttering flags and glinting bayonets. There were festivities every single day, balls and parties in succession, but the princess was not present yet. She was being brought up far away from there in a sacred temple, they said, where she was learning all the royal virtues. Finally, she arrived on the scene. The little mermaid was most eager to see her beauty, and she had to admit that she had never seen a fairer creature. Her skin was so fine and transparent, and behind the long, dark eyelashes there was a small pair of blue, faithful eyes. "It's you," the prince said. "You who had saved me when I lay like a corpse on the shore." And he embraced his blushing bride. "Oh, I am far too fortunate," he said. To the little mermaid, "The best thing I could ever have hoped for has been fulfilled for me. You will rejoice in my good fortune, for you are more fond of me than all the others." And the little mermaid kissed his hand, and she seemed to feel her heart break. His wedding morning would bring her death and turn her into sea foam on the sea. The church bells rang out, and heralds rolled through the streets and announced the engagement. Fragrant oil burned in precious silver lamps on all the altars. The priest swung incense, and the bride and the bridegroom joined hands and received the bishop's blessing. The little mermaid stood in silk and gold and held the bride's train, but her ear did not hear the festive music. Her eye did not see the holy ceremony. She only thought of her death night, of all that she had lost in this world. That very same evening, the bride and bridegroom boarded the ship, and the cannons were fired, all the flags waved, and a fine tent of gold and purple had been raised in the middle of the ship, with the loveliest cushions. There the wedding couple were to sleep in the still, cool night, and the sails swelled out into the wind, and the ship glided lightly and without any great motion across the clear water. And when it grew dark, many colored lamps were lit, and the sailors danced merrily on the deck. The little mermaid had to The little mermaid had to think of the first time she surfaced from the depths and saw the same magnificence and happiness. And she whirled around in the dance too, floated like swallow. Wait. Give a moment for the train to pass. Maybe it's gone? I don't even know. The little mermaid had to think of the first time she surfaced from the depths and saw the same magnificence and happiness. And she whirled around in the dance too, floated like the swallow floats when it is being pursued, and everyone expressed their great admiration. Never had she danced so wonderfully. It felt like sharp knives in her fine, small feet, but she did not notice it. It was nothing compared to the pain in her heart. She knew this world would be the last evening she would see the man whom she had abandoned her home and her family, given up her lovely voice, and suffered endless torment every day, without him having any idea of this. This was the last night she would breathe the same air as he did, see the deep ocean and the star-studded sky. An eternal night without thought or dream awaited her. She who had no soul would never be able to gain one. And there was a joy and merriment on board until way after midnight. She laughed and danced, but with the thought of her death in her heart. The prince kissed his lovely bride, and she played with his black hair, and arm in arm they retired to the magnificent tent. It grew quiet and still on board, with only the mate still on duty. The little mermaid laid her white arm on the railing and looked eastwards towards the approaching dawn. The first rays of the sun she knew would kill her. Then she saw her sisters rise up from the sea. They were pale as she was. Their long, beautiful hair no longer fluttered in the wind. It had been completely cut off. We have given it to the witch so that she can bring help and prevent you from dying this night. She has given us a knife. Here it is. Can you see how sharp it is? Before the sun rises, you must plunge it into the prince's heart, and when his warm blood splatters onto your feet, they will once more become a fish's tail, and you will become a mermaid once again, and be able to come down into the water to us and live your 300 years before you are turned into dead, salty sea foam. Hurry, either he or you must die before the sun rises. Our old grandmother is grieving so much that her white hair has fallen off, just as ours did at the witch's scissors. Kill the prince and come back. Hurry, can't you see the red streak in the sky? In a few minutes the sun will rise and you will have to die. And they let out a strangely deep sigh and sank down into the waves. The little mermaid pulled by the purple curtain from the tent, and she saw the lovely bride sleeping with her head on the prince's breast, and she bent down and kissed him on his handsome forehead, looked up at the sky where the dawn grew stronger and stronger, looked down at the sharp knife, and once more fixed her eyes on the prince, who named his bride by the name in his dreams. She alone was in his thoughts, and the knife shook in the mermaid's hands. But then she flung it far across the waves, which gleamed red, and it fell, so it looked like drops of blood trickling up out of the ocean, out of the water. Once more she gazed at the prince with half-lidded eyes, rushed off the ship down into the sea, and felt her body dissolve into foam. Now the sun rose out of the sea. Its rays fell so gently and warmly on the deathly cold sea foam, and the little mermaid did not feel death. She saw the bright sun, and up above her there floated hundreds of transparent, lovely creatures. Though she could not see the ship's white sails and the sky red clouds, their voice was a melody, but so spiritual that no human ear could hear it, just as no earthly eye could see them. Without wings, they floated in their own lightness through the air. "Who am I coming to?" she said, and her voice sounded like those of other beings, so spiritual that no earthly music could reproduce it. "To the daughters of the air," the others replied. "A mermaid has no immortal soul, can never gain one unless she wins the love of a human being. Her eternal being depends on foreign force. The daughters of the air do not have an eternal soul either, but by good deeds they are able to create one for themselves. We fly to the warm countries where the sultry plague air kills people. There we fan cool air on them. We spread the scent of flowers through the air and send refreshment and cure. When we have strived to do all the good we can for 300 years, we are granted an immortal soul and take part in the eternal happiness of humans. You, poor little mermaid, have striven to do the same with all your heart as we do. You have suffered and endured, have lifted yourself up to the realm of the spirits of the air. Now, though your good deeds can create for yourself an immortal soul in 300 years' time. And the little mermaid lifted her clear arms towards God's Son, and for the first time she felt tears. On board the ship there was no noise nor life once more. She saw the prince with his lovely bride searching for her. Sadly, they stared at the bubbly foam, as if they had known she had thrown herself into the waves. Unseen, she kissed the bride's forehead, smiled at him, and rose with the other children of the air onto the rosy cloud that sailed through the sky. In 300 years' time, she will sail thus into the kingdom of God. We can now enter in earlier than that. We can also enter in earlier than that, one of them whispered. We can float unseen into the homes of humans who have children, and each time we find a good child that gladdens its parents and earns their love, God shortens our probation. The child is unaware of us flying through the living room, but when we smile with joy at it, 1 year is taken away from our 300. But if we see a naughty and wicked child, then we have to cry tears of sorrow. Each tear adds a further day to our time of probation. And that's the end. A fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen. Very interesting, kind of the ending. Basically, be a good child so that these poor souls can, poor unfortunate can get closer to having an immortal soul? What the fuck? Why are there fireworks outside? Yeah, I agree. He's an amazing author. It was a long story, but I really enjoyed it. I'm sorry. I hope that you guys were able to get some rest. And I may be able to read one last story. It's a bit long, but I think I can read it. Just give me a moment. I'll be right back, okay? Okay, I'm back, everyone. I can read one more story if you would like. If it will help you get more comfy and sleep, I wouldn't mind. But I think a majority of everyone may have fallen asleep already. Alright, I will try one more story. Once upon a time, there was a woman who was very much wanted to have a tiny little child, but did not know where she could get one from. So she went to an old witch and said, "I do so want to have a little child. Will you kindly tell me where I can get one?" "Oh, we can manage that," said the witch. "There's a barley corn for you. It isn't the kind that grows in the farmer's fields, or that the chickens have to eat. Just put it in a flower pot and you will see what you shall see." "Much obliged," said the woman, and gave the witch 12 pennies. Pence? And went home and planted the barley corn, and very soon a fine large flower came up, which looked just like a tulip, but the petals were closed up tight as if it was still a bud. "That is a charming flower," said the woman, and gave it a kiss on its pretty red and yellow petals. But just as she kissed it, the flower gave a loud crack and opened, and you can see it was a real tulip, only right in the middle of it, on the green stool that there was, sat a tiny little girl, as delicate and pretty as could be. She was only a thumb joint long, so she was called Thumbelina. She was given a splendid walnut shell for her cradle, and blue-violet leaves for mattresses, and a rose leaf for a counterpane. And there she slept at night, but in the daytime she played about on the table where the woman had put a plate round which she had put a whole wreath of flowers with their stalks in the water, and on the water floated a large tulip leaf on which Thumbelina could sit and sail from one side of the plate to the other. She had 2 white horse hairs to row with it. It was really beautiful to see her, and she could sing too, and oh, she had the most delicate and beautiful voice no one had ever heard. One night, as she lay in her pretty little bed, a horrid toad came hopping at the window, which had a broken pane. The toad was ugly and big and wet, and hopped right down onto the table where Thumbelina lay asleep under her rose leaf. "That would make a lovely wife for my son," said the toad. So she took hold of the walnut shell where Thumbelina slept and hopped off with it through the window and down into the garden. Through it flowed a big, broad stream, but just at the edge it was marshy and muddy. Sorry. It's okay, Jaxie. And there the toad lived with her son. Oh, he was so ugly and horrid too, just like his mother. Croaking sounds was all he could say, and when he saw the pretty little girl in the walnut shell, "Don't talk so loud, you'll wake her up," said the old toad, "and she might run away from us now, for she's as light as a swan down feather. We'll put her out in the river on one of the broad water lily leaves. It'll be like an island for her, she's so light and tiny. She can run about there while we get the drawing room under the mud ready for you two to make your home in." Oh my. There was a great many water lilies growing out in the stream, with broad green leaves that looked as if they were floating on the water. And the leaf that was furthest out was also the biggest of them all. To this leaf the old toad swam out and put the walnut shell with Thumbelina on it. The poor little wretch woke up very early in the morning, and when she saw where she was, she began to cry, oh so bitterly, for there was water all around the big leaf, and she couldn't possibly get to land. The old toad stayed down in the mud and set about decorating her room with rushes and yellow water lily buds, so as to make it nice and neat for her new daughter-in-law. Then she swam out with her ugly son to the leaf where Thumbelina stood. They were going to fetch her pretty bed and put it up in the bridal chamber before she came there herself. The old toad curtsied low in the water before she said to her, I present you my son. He is going to be your husband, and you will lead a delightful life with him down in the mud. Croaks, croaks, was all the son could say. So they took the beautiful little bed and swam off with it, while Thumbelina sat all alone on the green leaf crying, for she didn't want to live with the horrid toad, or have her ugly son for a husband. The little fishes swimming beneath the water had seen the toad and heard what she said, so they put their heads up. They wanted to see the little girl, but as soon as they saw her, they thought her so pretty that it grieved them very much to think she had to go down to the ugly toad. No, that could never be. So they swam together down in the water, all around the green stalk that held the leaf that she was on, and gnawed it through with their little teeth, so that the leaf went floating down the stream, and bore Thumbelina far, far away, where the toad could not go. Thumbelina sailed past many places, and the little birds in the bushes saw her and sang, What a beautiful little maid! The leaf floated further and further with her, and thus it was Thumbelina went on her travels. A beautiful little white butterfly kept flying around her, and at last settled on the leaf, and it took a fancy to Thumbelina, and she was very happy, for now the toad could not get her, and everything was beautiful where she was sailing. The sun shone on the water and made it glitter like gold. She took her sash and tied one of it to the end of the butterfly, and the other end she fastened it to the leaf, and went along much faster with her, for of course she was standing on the leaf. But then a large cockchafer came flying by and caught sight of her, and in an instant he grasped her slender body in his claws and flew up to the tree with her. But the green leaf went floating downstream, and the butterfly with it, for he was tied to the leaf and could not get loose. Goodness, how frightened poor Thumbelina was when this cockchafer flew up into the tree with her. But she was most of all grieved for the pretty little butterfly, which she had tied to the leaf, for unless it got loose it would be starved to death. However, the cockchafer cared nothing about that. He alighted with her on the largest green leaf of the tree and gave her honey out of one of the flowers to eat, and told her she was very pretty, though she wasn't in the least like a cockchafer. What is this word? Later, all the other cockchafers that lived in the tree came and paid calls. They looked at Thumbelina and saw a young lady cockchafer. They looked at Thumbelina and the young lady cockchafers brushed their feelers and said, Why, she's only got 2 legs! What a wretched sight! She's got no feelers, they said. She's quite thin in the waist. Dreadful. She looks like a human being. How ugly she is. And all the ladies, yet Thumbelina was as pretty as she could be, and so she thought the cockchafer who had carried her off. But when all the rest said she was horrid, he came to think so at last, and wouldn't have anything to do with her. She could go wherever she chose. So he let her go wherever she wanted. They flew down from the tree with her and put her on a daisy, and there she sat and cried because she was so ugly that the cockchafers wouldn't keep her. And yet she was the prettiest thing you could imagine, and delicate and bright like the loveliest rose leaf. Oh my god, so mean. All the summer through, poor Thumbelina lived quite alone in the big wood. She plaited herself a bed of green stalks and hung it up under a large dock leaf so that she could be out of the rain. She picked the honey out of the flowers and ate it, and she drank the dew which lay every morning on the leaves. She spent the summer and the autumn, but then came the winter, the long, cold winter. All the birds that had sung so beautifully for her blew away, and the trees and the flowers began to wither, and the big dock leaf under which she had lived rolled up and turned nothing but a yellow dry stalk. And she was so terribly cold, for her clothes were in rags, and she herself was so little and delicate. Poor Thumbelina, she was likely to be frozen to death. And then it began to snow, and every snowflake that fell on her was just as when anybody throws a whole shovel of snow on any of us. For we are big, and Thumbelina was only an inch high, so she wrapped herself up in a dead leaf, but there was no warmth in it, and she shriveled up with the cold. Just outside the woods, where she was now, lay a large cornfield, but the corn had been long off it. I'm sorry for the background sound. And only the bare, dry stubble stuck out from the frozen ground. This was like a whole forest for her to get through, and oh, how she did shiver with cold. At last she came to the field mouse's door, which was a little hole down among the stubble. There the field mouse lived snug and happy, with a whole room full of corn, a lovely kitchen, and a dining room. Poor Thumbelina went up to the door, just like any beggar girl, and asked for a little bit of barley corn, for she hadn't had anything whatever to eat for 2 days. Poor little thing, the field mouse, who was at heart a kind old field mouse. You come into my warm room and have dinner with me. And as she had taken a liking to Thumbelina, she said, you can stay the winter with me and welcome, only you'll have to keep my room nice and clean and tell me stories, for I am very fond of them. And Thumbelina did as the field mouse asked her, and had a very pleasant time of it. He had recently, Oh, we shall soon be having a visitor, said the field mouse. My neighbor calls me every weekend. He's even better house than I am. His rooms are big, and he goes about in such a beautiful black velvet coat. Ah, if only you could have him as for a husband, you would be well set up. But you see, there is a thing he can't see. Mind and tell him the very prettiest stories you know. But Thumbelina didn't care much about this. She didn't want to marry the neighbor, for he was a mole. He came and paid a call in his black velvet coat, and he was very well off and very learned, and the field mouse said his mansion was more than 20 times the size of hers, and he was very well informed. But he didn't like it when the sun and the pretty flowers and abused them, for he had never seen them. Thumbelina had to sing, and she sang both about the cockchafer to fly home. Wait a minute. Thumbelina had to sing, and she sang both cockchafer, cockchafer, fly away home, and also the monk walked in the meadow. And the mole fell in love with her for her beautiful voice, but said nothing about it, for he was a very cautious man. He had recently dug a big passage through the earth from his house to theirs, and gave the field mouse and Thumbelina leave to walk there whenever they liked, but he begged them not to be frightened at the dead bird that lay in the passage, a whole bird with beak and feathers, which had certainly been dead only a little time at the beginning of winter, and was now buried where he had made his passage. The mole took a bit of touchwood in his mouth, for that shines like fire in the dark, and went in front and lighted them along the long dark passage. And when they got to where the dead bird lay, the mole pushed his broad back against the ceiling and lifted the earth, so that there was a big hole which let in the light. In the middle of the floor lay a dead swallow, with its pretty wings closed against its side, and its legs held down in among its feathers. The poor bird had certainly died of cold. Thumbelina was very sorry for it, but she was fond of all the little birds that had sung and had twittered so prettily at her for all the summer long. But the mole kicked it with its long short leg and said, "He won't be I'm sorry. He won't be squeaking any more. It must be wretched to be born a little bird. Thank God none of my children will be like that. A bird has nothing but its twit, 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 and it's bound to starve to death in winter." "Yes, you may be well so, as a reasonable man," said the field mouse. "What has the bird to show for all its twit, twit, twit when the winter comes? Why, it has to starve and freeze, and yet they're so proud about it." Thumbelina said nothing, but when the others turned their backs on the bird, she stooped down and parted the feathers that covered its head and kissed its dead eyes. Perhaps this was the one that sang so prettily, so beautifully in the summer, she thought. She thought, what a lot of pleasure it gave me, this dear little bird. The mole now stopped up. Oh my. The mole now stopped up the hole through which the daylight shone in, and saw the lady's home, but that night Thumbelina couldn't sleep at all, so she sat out of bed and plaited a nice large cover of hay, and carried it down and spread it about on the dead bird. And then she laid some soft cotton wool she had found in the field mouse's room on the bird's side, so that it may lie warmly on the cold ground. "Farewell, you little pretty bird," said she. "Farewell, and thank you for your lovely singing in the summer, when all the trees were green and the sun shone so hot on us." She laid her head against the bird's heart and got quite frightful all at once, for it seemed as if something was knocking inside. It was the bird's heart. The bird was not dead, it was only a swoon, and now that it was warmed, it came to life again. In the autumn, you know all the swallows fly away to warm countries, but if there is one that lags behind, it gets frozen so that it tumbles down quite dead and lays where it fell, and the cold snow covers it over. Thumbelina really shivered so frightfully, was she, for the bird was enormously big compared to her, who was only an inch high, but she took courage and laid the cotton wool closer about the poor swallow, and folded a peppermint leaf that she had for her own counterpane, and put it over the bird's head. Next night she stole down to it again, and this time it was quite alive, but so weak that it could only open its eyes for a second. Room to look at Thumbelina, who stood there with a bit of touchwood in her hand. For other light she had none. Thank you, pretty child. Thank you, you pretty little child, the sick swallow said to her. I've been beautifully warmed. Soon I shall get my I'm so sorry, everyone. Okay, there we go. Soon I will get my strength back and be able to fly again in the warm sun outside. Oh, said Thumbelina, but it's dreadfully cold right now. It's snowing and freezing. You must stay in your warm bed. I'll nurse you, be sure. Then she brought the swallow some water in the leaf of a plant, and it drank it, and told her how it had hurt its wing on a thorn bush, so it couldn't fly as well as the other swallows when they set out to fly far, far away to the warm countries. At last it had fallen to the ground, but it couldn't remember any more and didn't in the least know how it got to where it was. All the winter it stayed down there, and Thumbelina was very kind to it, and got very fond of it, but neither nor the mole nor the field mouse heard anything about it. They disliked the poor, wretched swallow. As soon as spring came, the sun's warmth got into the ground, and the swallow said goodbye to Thumbelina, who opened the hole which the mole had made above. The sun shone in delightfully, and the swallow asked if Thumbelina would not come with it. She could sit on its back, and they could fly away into the greenwood, but Thumbelina knew that it would grieve the old field mouse if she left her like that. No, I can't, said Thumbelina. Goodbye, goodbye, you pretty little maid, said the swallow, and flew out into the sunshine. Thumbelina stood looking after it, and the water stood in her eyes, and she was very fond of the poor swallow. Twit, twit, sang the bird, and flew off into the greenwood. Thumbelina was very unhappy. She got no chance to go out into the warm sunshine because the corn had been sown in the field over the field mouse's house had grown tall and made a thick forest for the poor little maid, more than an inch high. This summer you must make your trousseau. I'm not sure what that is. It's a French word. The field mouse told her, for the neighbor, the tiresome mole in the black velvet coat, had proposed to her. You shall have both woolen and linen, something to sit in and to lie on when you are the mole's wife. So Thumbelina had to spin on the distance, and the field mouse hired 4 spiders to spin and weave day and night. Every evening the mole called in, and they always talked about how the summer was over, the sun wouldn't be near as hot. But now it was scorching and the ground as hard as stone. Ah, yes, when the summer was over, Thumbelina should be married. But she wasn't at all pleased, and she didn't like the tiresome mole one bit. Every morning when the sun rose, and every evening when it set, she stole away out to the door, and there, when the wind parted the heads of the corn so that she could see the blue sky, she thought how bright and pretty it was outside, and longed to get another sight of her dear swallow. But he never came. He must certainly be flying far away into the beautiful green one. But by the time the autumn came, Thumbelina had all her trousseau ready. I think it's like a dress. I'm sorry, everyone. In 4 weeks' time you shall be married, the field mouse told her. But Thumbelina cried and said she wouldn't marry the tiresome mole. Rubbish, said the field mouse. Don't be pig-headed, or I'll bite you with my white teeth. It is a splendid husband you're getting. The queen herself hasn't the like of his black velvet coat, and a full kitchen and cellar he has too. Just you thank the maker for him. So the wedding was to be. Already the mole had come to fetch Thumbelina, and with him she must go deep underground and never come out to the warm sun, for he couldn't stand it. The poor child bitterly grieved, for now she must bid farewell to the beautiful sunshine, which she had at least had the chance of seeing. Oh my, which she hadn't at least had the chance of seeing from the field mouse's door. Farewell, farewell, bright sun, she said, stretching her arms upwards and stepping a little way outside the field mouse's house, for now the corn was reaped, and only the dry stubble left. Farewell, farewell, she said again, and threw her arms about a little red flower that grew there. Give my love to the dear swallow for me if you ever see him. Twit, twit sounded at the moment, right above her head. She looked up, and there the swallow was flying. By. He was overjoyed when he caught sight of Thumbelina, and she told him how she hated to have the ugly mole for a husband, and how she must live right down underground where the sun never shone. She couldn't help but cry. Cold winter is coming, said the swallow. I am going to fly far away to the warm countries. Will you come with me? You can sit on my back. Only tie yourself tight with your sash, and we shall fly far away from the ugly mole and his dark home, far over the mountains to the warm countries where the sun shines fairer than here, and there will always be summer and lovely flowers. Do fly away with me, you sweet little Thumbelina, who has saved my life when I lay frozen in that dark cellar underground. Yes, I will come with you, said Thumbelina. So she got up on the bird's back, put her feet up on the outspread wings, and tied her belt fast onto his strong feathers, and flew off the swallow high in the air, over the forest and lake, high above the great mountains where the snow always lies, and where Thumbelina might have frozen in the cold air, but that she crept in among the bird's warm feathers, only put her little head out to see the beauty beneath her. At last they got to the warm countries. There the sun shone far brighter than here, and the sky seemed twice as high, and the hedges and the ditches grew the loveliest clusters of grapes and green and purple. In the woods grew oranges and lemons, and there was a scent of mint in the air, and the roads were pretty. Children ran about and played with great gay butterflies. But the swallow flew still further, and the country grew more and more delightful. Under splendid trees, beside a blue lake, stood a shining palace of white marble, built in ancient days. with creepers twining about its tall pillars. And, at its top were a number of swallow nests, one of which the home of the swallow who was carrying Thumbelina. "Here is my house," said the swallow, "but won't you look out for yourself one of the finest of the flowers that grow down below? And I'll put it here for you, and you shall find everything as happy as your heart wishes it to be." "That will be lovely," said she, and clapped her little hands. A great white marble column lay there, which she had fallen down and broken into 3 pieces. Whoa, wait, what? A great white marble column lay there, which had fallen down and broken into 3 pieces. Oh my god, no, I'm not killing Thumbelina off, guys. I just read it wrong. Between them grew large white flowers. The swallow flew down with Thumbelina and set her on one of the broad leaves. But what a surprise of her! A little man was sitting in the middle of the flower, as white and transparent as if he was made of glass, with the prettiest gold crown on his head and the loveliest bright wings on his shoulder, and he was no bigger than Thumbelina. He was the angel of the flower, and in each of them there lived such another little man or woman, but this one was the king of them all. "Goodness, how beautiful he is," Thumbelina whispered to the swallow. The little prince was quite alarmed by the swallow, which was a giant bird to him, tiny and delicate as he was. But when he saw Thumbelina, he was delighted, for she was the far prettiest girl he had ever seen. He took his gold crown off his head and laid it upon hers, asked her what her name was and whether she could be his wife, for then she would become a queen of all the flowers. There indeed was a husband, very different from the toad's son or the mole with his black velvet coat. So she said yes to the handsome prince, and out of every flower there came a lady or a lord, so pretty that it was a pleasure to see them. Everyone brought Thumbelina a present, but the best of all was a pair of beautiful wings from a big white fly. They were fastened to a Thumbelina's back, and then she could fly from flower to flower. There was a great rejoicings, and the swallow sat on his nest up there and sang to them as well as he could. But at heart he was sad, for he was very fond of Thumbelina, and would have liked to have never been parted from her. "You shall not be called Thumbelina," the angel of the flower said to her. "It is an ugly name, and you are very pretty. We will call you Maya." "Goodbye, goodbye," said the swallow, when he flew away from the warm countries far, far back to Denmark. Then he had a little nest above the window where the man who can tell stories lives, and he sang "Twit, twit," and that's the way we came by the whole story. And that's the end of Thumbelina. You know what? Thanks to I never knew Hans Christian Andersen was Danish. I didn't even know that until now, because it says far back to Denmark. They were fairies, yeah, but in the story they call them angels of the flowers, which is kind of cute. Anyway, everyone, we have reached 2 hours. I hope you had a good time here and that you're very cozy and that you enjoyed the stories. I'm very sorry for the ambient sounds in the back and my terrible pronunciation. I'm really sorry about that too. But I really enjoyed it. I love reading these stories with you guys. it's also nice to be able to have it on YouTube so people can rewatch it if they want. But the ambient sounds. But anyway, good night, everyone. I love you. Have a wonderful night, okay? Or morning, or evening, or afternoon. I hope you enjoyed it, and don't worry. I'm really glad to hear that. Thank you, everyone, for coming by. Yes, Old English is kind of hard, but it's interesting. I love you guys, okay? I'm gonna go get some rest, and I may not stream today. I may cancel my stream. But that's okay, because we always have Monday. I'm glad to hear that, Nick. Thank you guys for coming by. Have a wonderful day, okay? Or night. I love you, and I'm really happy that you came by and spent time with me. I really do appreciate it. A good morning kiss, a good night kiss, or even a good evening or afternoon kiss. One you deserve very well. I love you, sweeties. I'll see you later, okay? Thank you for coming by and spending time with me. I really do appreciate it. I love you. And don't worry, no apologizing. Take care of yourself, okay? I love you guys.